Good evening and welcome to St Giles Cathedral for this third of the Chalmers Lectures 2017. My name's Callum MacLeod, I'm the minister here at St Giles, and we're delighted to be hosting this series of lectures, and we look forward to what Doug has to share with us this evening. We ask, of course, that you might switch off cell phones and things like that, electronic devices. We welcome those of you who are joining us online. There has been a very good pick-up on the number of people joining us online, so welcome to you. Housekeeping, the toilet facilities are to my left down the stairs, and then the gents to the left and ladies to the right. We invite you to join us for a reception after the lecture in the Murray Aisle, which is on the other side of the cathedral, the west end on the left, and there you can also see a memorial plaque to Thomas Chalmers, for whom these lectures are given in memory. So again, welcome to St Giles. We're glad you're here, glad you're with us online, and I'd like to invite John Chalmers, Principal Clerk, to introduce our guest, our lecturer.
Thank you, Callum. Once again, let me welcome those of you in attendance and those of you tuning in online to this, the third in our series of the Chalmers Lectures for 2017. It's my delight as Chairman of the Chalmers Lectureship Trust to welcome you all here. The lectures this time around have stimulated a huge amount of interest. It's a very long time, if ever, that the physical attendance at the Chalmers Lecture Series has ever been so high. And for those of you at home, St Giles, I can tell you, has enjoyed attendances of well over 100 on each of these occasions, and same again tonight. And hundreds of you have tuned in at home, and up to thousands of you have downloaded and listened again. Of course, the fact that these lectures can be live streamed is hugely significant. The belief, however, that I have is that it's the subject matter that has been of so much interest and is continuing to generate interest. People care about the future of our church. People are searching for answers to difficult questions about how we reshape our life and how we reset our priorities. People are conscious that what we have known as church is struggling for survival. But they are equally clear that the need for the gospel to be outlived and expressed in new and relevant ways is as urgent as ever. So they have tuned in. And I hope that people across Scotland will stay tuned in to the possibilities that the future still holds in store for us, tuned in to some of the possibilities that Doug Gay has been opening up for us. Whatever else we might have learned in the course of these past 3 weeks, and whatever else we will learn tonight, the trustees of the Chalmers Lectureship have, I think, discovered a new purpose. That the trust might be used as a vehicle through which serious discussion about the church's future can be engaged in a new way. And although my tenure as chairman will come to an end with my retiral from the office of Principal Clerk, my very strong recommendation is that the trust should now be used to provide more frequent, maybe even regular online contributions from people who can challenge us to re-examine a whole range of elements of our common life which need to be refreshed. Some of these are theological, some of them are constitutional, and as Doug has said, they are spiritual, liturgical, they are missional, and they are institutional. I think the Chalmers Lecture Series has found a new place, and it's my sincere hope that the new trustees after this General Assembly will meet soon to develop this resource as an inspiration for discussion in local kirk sessions, in congregations, in presbyteries, and in church councils. But that is for the future. Tonight, we warmly welcome you, Doug, back to the stage to deliver the third of these important talks. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Callum. In tonight's lecture, I want to turn to broader questions of institutional reform, though still looking at these questions through the lens of holistic mission. I will try to take a wide-angle look at the federal structure of the church as a whole and the ways in which we try to keep our institutional balance across different levels of governance and organization. As with other issues that I have addressed in the lectures, the questions here are not new, and nor are many of the proposals. So much of what I will be doing is reflecting on why I think the questions still matter, and why this might now be the right time for the proposed reforms. I want to recognize from the outset that it may seem like hubris for anyone to presume to redraw the shape of the church as a whole. I'm very aware of that. So the title for tonight's lecture, Grand Designs, is both a joke at my own expense and a signal to you that I know how this may look. That said, I want to go on and make a serious point about the kind of questions we are dealing with here. A point which I think also helps to explain why some previous attempts at introducing major reforms have not, in that time-honored phrase, commended themselves to the mind of the church. In the first lecture, we looked at Presbyterianism as a polity, a form of government, order, organization for the church, which has a federal character. Federalism is sometimes seen within British political culture as a fancy European idea, which those rebel Americans took up with, but which we lucky Brits, blessed with an unwritten constitution, have no need for. At the root of federalism is the idea of a covenant, which is, of course, a rich theological and theopolitical idea. And we often stress that theologically it means something more than a contract. But when we use it in political terms or polity terms, its meaning is not so different. It describes a relationship between different elements of a polity. A federal system is a social and political contract about how to divide power and where to locate functions within a system. In particular, it lays out the relationship between the local, the regional, and the national. To spell it out then, in the Church of Scotland, our kirk sessions are local courts overseen by Presbytery, which is a regional court, overseen by General Assembly, which is the highest court of the national church. We have rules which govern their relationships, which include checks and balances. A session or an individual may appeal to the General Assembly against the decision of a presbytery. A General Assembly ruling may need a majority of presbyteries to vote in favor of it under the Barrier Act. We also have rules which govern the composition of the courts. Both Presbytery and General Assembly have to be representative of the church geographically, and they have to balance representation of ministers and elders. For many centuries, there was another tier within the system, the synod. But the 12 synods were abolished in Scotland 25 years ago this year. So we now have these three tiers or levels of governance within the kirk. And we also have our central councils, as they have been known since 2004. There are 6 of these: the Council of Assembly, which has a coordinating function, then Ministries Council, Mission and Discipleship Council, Church and Society Council, the World Mission Council, and the Social Care Council known as Crossreach. Alongside these, we have 27 additional committees, departments, and agencies. And the first thing I want to say tonight is that if we imagined all those who serve on those 6 councils and who work on their staffs, all those who oversee and service those 27 other bodies, if they were gathered together in one place, I think we would want to say to them, we in the church are in your debt. You are muscles and sinews within the body. You are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Your work and commitment and care are precious to the church, and we believe precious to God. If I worry about proposals for reform seeming presumptuous, I also worry about them seeming ungrateful. I have many friends who work at 121, whose work and witness, whose dedication, gifts, and vision I admire greatly. When we talk about reforming a system, we are not disrespecting those who work within it as it stands, and nor are we forgetting about them. What I will present tonight are only my thoughts, although they owe many debts to the work of others. But in this context, they have no other weight or backing. Even so, none of us should even argue for reform without realizing that our thought experiment is someone else's life, job, salary, home base, ministry, and vocation. Having said that, I am going to open up some radical options tonight. But I wanted to make it clear that I do realize this is about real people. It's also the case, though, that in any major institutional reform, whether it's a university or a government department, the NHS, a major charity, or a private company, some things will have to be done which will prove to be difficult for some of the individuals affected, but which are done in the hope that they will be for the good of the institution as a whole. Effective institutional reform refocuses an institution on its core mission and its core values. It reorders work and spend and time according to the priorities which flow from that mission. It does not know the price of everything and the value of nothing. It seeks to know the value of everything and to relate the price of things to their value. It is brave without being callous, and it is bold without being reckless. Ethical institutional reform consults with and cares for those affected by its actions. Ecclesial institutional reform understands reform is a spiritual task, is prayerful, seeks to be guided and animated by the Holy Spirit, has a theology of mission and ministry at its heart. It is neither institutionally Pelagian, believing it can do God's work in its own strength, through its own effort, by depending on its own strategies, nor is it institutionally docetic, forgetting that God works through ordinary human processes, methods, structures, and strategies. It cares about the peace and unity of the church. It values the church as a community of discernment and decision. Its great motto comes from Acts 15. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And it should always be haunted by 1 Corinthians 13, the concern that if we do this without love, then we are nothing and we gain nothing. So why do we need reform? And why might our federal identity need to be rebalanced? For the sake of mission, to support and empower congregations, to develop and enhance presbyteries, to refocus and renew our central bodies. For the sake of mission, then, remembering all that was said in the first lecture about the Missio Dei, about the church being the object of mission before it is a subject, about the church receiving mission before it is recruited to be part of it, we might go on to say this. In mission, the church stands before the world on behalf of God, not to build up its own status or position, but believing that God wants the world to know fullness of life. In mission, the church stands before the world in the way of Jesus Christ, believing that in Jesus, the Word made flesh, we see and know God more clearly and truly than anywhere else. That in his life and death and resurrection, the world was reconciled to God, and God is making an appeal to us and then to the world through us to be reconciled to God. In mission, the church stands before the world in the power of the Holy Spirit, believing that the Spirit's life is renewing our life and is the power of God's life and love at work in the world. As women and men are called to be reconciled to God, to find fullness of life in God, we believe they are being called into the same rhythm which is the heartbeat of the church's life, being called together in worship and sent in mission. In worship where Jesus is named as Lord, and in mission where Jesus is proclaimed as Savior, as Liberator, as Friend, in both word and in deed. We want our churches to grow, not out of vanity or insecurity, but because we want to see as many people as possible find meaning and hope through their faith in God, and find a community and family of faith which can be home to them. We recognize the mystery of God's sovereignty, but we also recognize our calling to be witnesses. Witnesses to what we know of God's truth, to what we can show of God's love, witnesses to the mercy, the grace, the justice, the beauty of God. So we want our churches, in those poignant words of John Bell's hymn, to be places where Christ makes with his friends a touching place, where people can be in touch with the love and mercy of God. Bill Hybels has said powerfully that the local church is the hope of the world. This is a vision for Aberfeldy and Uist, Kirkwall and Castle Douglas, Bearsden and Whitfield, Renfrew and the Raploch, that congregations of the Kirk, for all of their limitations and faults, can be touching places, can be places of hope. And yes, why would we not say this? A vision that they can be that for as many people as possible, and be that in spiritual and ecumenical partnership with anyone else in those places who shows the true face of the Kirk. I know there are Christians in Scotland who believe God is finished with the Church of Scotland, or at least is finished blessing it and blessing Scotland through it. But I don't believe that. What comes first is the integrity of our witness, because we understand throughout history there have been successful churches that were not faithful, and faithful churches that were not successful. But as we try by the grace of God to bear witness faithfully, a second faithful and heartfelt concern may be that we long to see our congregations grow, and as they grow, be salt and light, be communities which bless and enrich the parishes they're called to serve. Reform is for the sake of mission, and it is a demanding task. There are no books out there on how to undertake the successful reform of a Presbyterian church. What examples there are from other contexts where the choices made may have been right for them, but might not be right for us. What makes this a demanding task is that it has to help us to do 5 things. In the years between now and 2030, we will have to close unsustainable churches, manage declining churches, enable declining churches to grow again, support growing churches in their development, plant new churches, and replant some we have had to close. And the work of doing these 5 things simultaneously represents a huge challenge for us over the next 13 years. With this challenge comes the question of whether our institutional structures are ordered as well as they can be to support this work. And there are no definite or definitive answers to that question. It is a judgment call, a strategic judgment for us to make together as a church. We don't get to test it in advance in the lab, and we don't get to see the counterfactual scenario afterwards. But that's true probably of most things in life. So why do I think we should consider radical change? Well, there is one overriding reason. We need to offer more effective support to the witness of local congregations. For me, that is the decisive concern of reform. It was, of course, the key concern also behind the Church Without Walls report. So we need to ask if a program of reform could help us to do this. And when that is put into a wider institutional context, I think it points to one other conclusion. The key level at which this support has to be delivered is the presbytery. So the question about supporting local congregations is also a question about making presbyteries work. It is intrinsic to a federal structure that it works as a system, which is why, although it might seem like hubris to talk of reforming the system as a whole, in fact, it is the only way to do it. If you don't adjust both central councils and regional presbyteries simultaneously, you almost by definition end up making it impossible to properly reform them separately. Because you can't have a conversation about how to redistribute powers or functions between the two ends of the spectrum. I think it's hard to draw any other conclusion from the 2001 Church Without Walls report, the 2001 Tomorrow's Presbyteries report, the 2006 Structure and Change Commission, the 2011 Review and Reform report. If you sit down and read them together, as I have, this point is made in every one of them. Since 1975, we have had 46, now 43 Scottish presbyteries, which vary in size from well over 100 to less than 10 charges. It's not uniform and it's not at the same level, but there is a high level of dissatisfaction across the church with how presbyteries work. Because many of them don't work particularly well at the moment, it's hard to imagine them giving them more power or more functions. And many of them are too small to cope with that in any case. One significant change since 2011 is that the presbytery planning process has further exposed the pressures in congregations and at times has strained the bonds between local congregations and presbyteries. If we approach the question from the other end, we need to consider how effectively our current system of councils works. I am completely sincere in saying that within them, as they stand, there are many outstanding individuals who do creative, effective, and invaluable work. But I have spent the last 10 years deeply unconvinced by the current division between ministries and mission and discipleship in particular. I don't think it makes theological or missional sense in terms of where the church should be heading. Nor am I convinced about the articulation of the relationship between church and society and mission and discipleship in terms of modeling and enabling holistic models of witness. I can therefore see convincing, perhaps even compelling reasons to introduce reform for both the regional and the central church, and to rebalance the federal identity and organization of the church. We need stronger missional leadership at regional level. We need more effective training and support at local level. Too much power, resource, and initiative is held centrally, not enough regionally and locally. The church is too bureaucratic. It asks too much of too many to too little effect. It has been observed by a number of commentators, including former Principal Clark, Finlay MacDonald, in his 2004 book on a changing church, that the Kirk consumes too much of its members' and ministers' time and energy in keeping the system going. Our processes and procedures are too expansive, too exhausting, and too expensive. We have too many meetings, which consume too many people hours. We pay too many sets of travel expenses and employ too many administrators to clerk and service committees. In 2016, the Church's Nominations Committee reported that they were busy preparing to fill 127 vacancies that year on central committees and councils to replace those who'd moved on in that year, out of a total of some 493 members serving on those bodies. That's before we add in the hours spent locally in Kirk sessions and their subcommittees, and the hours spent attending presbytery committees and working groups, And it's before our elders and ministers have ventured out to take part in ecumenical forums or community councils or be active within political parties and voluntary organizations. The current division of councils, along with their relative autonomy in finance and governance, perpetuates a silo mentality, which includes both competition for resources and defense of council prerogatives, with no adequate management mechanism other than the General Assembly itself for integrating the work of different councils. The Council of Assembly has improved coordination, but it's never been given a true management role and probably cannot be given it within the system as it stands. So what should we do? I believe there are 5 key structural reforms which, if enacted, could help the Church to respond more effectively in fulfilling its missional calling to the people of Scotland and, crucially, to support the witness of local congregations. Presbytery reform. The currently existing 43 Scottish presbyteries should be reduced to 12 regional presbyteries, each of which should have a stipendiary elected moderator holding office for a 5-year term and a salaried appointed clerk. The new presbyteries would be given substantial devolved financial responsibility for deploying and resourcing ministry within their bounds. They would be governed by a council and would meet in full presbytery 2 to 4 times a year. Secondly, council reform. The 4 main central councils should be merged into one single Church of Scotland mission agency, which would work with internal ministry divisions, but under a single management structure. There would be a distinctive arrangement for Crossreach. The numbers working for central councils and bodies would be reduced by up to 1/3, and new congregational support posts would be created within the new presbyteries. Thirdly, central government reform. The work of the new central agency should be governed by a properly federal Council of Assembly, comprised of elder and minister representatives from each presbytery. A mission agency secretary would lead a team of senior managers. Now, I want to pause here and reflect on how this rebalances our federal identity. We have traditionally been allergic to the idea of a strong central management within the Church. Now, this suggestion would create one, but it would also offset it by devolving substantial power from the centre to the presbyteries. It envisages a leaner, tighter, central spine to the institution and then balances this with fewer, stronger presbyteries. For the first time, it imagines a properly federal central council made up of presbytery representatives from across Scotland. I want to move on to think about the General Assembly. The model I'm describing imagines many fewer members sitting on central councils and committees. Now, the danger with that is of a loss of connection and of participation. What offsets that, I suggest, is a continuing annual General Assembly, which of course would remain the highest court of the Church. This is how we bring in a wider perspective while easing the burden of populating councils and committees. We embrace the General Assembly as an asset, both in governance terms and as a symbolic witness which projects the identity of the Church. And we build on the success of Heart and Soul, which is the Kirk in festival mode. Finally, congregations. In line with the case made during the first lecture, the legal rights and functions of congregations and congregational meetings in relation to Kirk sessions should be clarified and strengthened. Now, you may be wondering if I have worked out in detail all of the anomalies, difficulties, and tensions which would be created by such a system, and the answer is, of course, I haven't. For example, I have nothing invested in there being 12 presbyteries rather than 7, 9, 11, or 14. I want to add a few more notes to this grand design and then consider one final question. One thing to stress, and here you may want to read my lips, is that the full-time presbytery moderators would emphatically not be bishops. What draws me to the idea, though, is seeing how effectively some dioceses within the Church of England have begun to mobilize and reform themselves for mission. The Presbytery Mods would, of course, work alongside the Rockers, the new generation presbytery clerks, most of whom might not be ordained, and who would lead in the managerial, financial, legal, and administrative spheres. The key charge to the Mods would be to support mission and support ministers. The big question for Scots Presbyterians is, could we bear, and dare we try, to incorporate stronger personal mission ministries of initiative and support within Presbyterian governance, while maintaining a clear emphasis on corporate episcopacy. Another point to recognize is that larger presbyteries could, of course, feel remote. And like the panel on review and reform, I believe that churches would still want to meet in more local settings, but that these would try to recover the original functions of presbyteries in promoting mutual encouragement and support. Business and governance would be done at the regional level by local representatives. 3 or 4 local meetings each year could focus on training, consultation, worship, and fellowship without the burden of a business agenda. And we would still have met on fewer occasions per year than many presbyteries do now. My hope for the new mod posts and for stronger presbyteries is that they would help us to be more strategic and creative about mission. And they would help us to get much better at resourcing and supporting ministers and deacons and readers and elders and members to equip them for the work of ministry. If there were to be a single new mission agency, one priority for me would be to not simply turn the existing 4 council domains into new ministry divisions, but to think creatively about new ways to assign work. It feels to me that we are overdue a moment of refocusing, of streamlining, of simplifying. There is a kind of Victorian Gothic quality to our institutional architecture. It's time to knock down some solid walls, take out some pews, put up some new glass partitions, and create some cleaner, clearer, fit-for-purpose spaces. And talking of spaces, the key symbolic focus of some of what we need to move on from might well be the building at 121 George Street itself. If we could ever make it work in terms of stewardship, and that may be a big if, it would be great if we could treat ourselves to a new beginning somewhere else. The ideal would be a building which could be built or converted to somehow be an architectural statement of the kind of holistic witness that we want to offer to 21st century Scotland. I am nearly done. I may have done enough already to send you running back to George Street to embrace the old pillars and say, all is forgiven. We took a look at an alternative future and it was horrible. In my defense, I have tried to do what I hope the church might want its academics to do, to think aloud in public, to think theologically about church practice, and to speak the truth in love. I've tried to be provocative without being annoying, to be bold without being naive, to be cautious without being timid. As I said in the first lecture, and I meant it, if these lectures have any gifts to give to the church, among them will be the gift of being wrong, hopefully in ways that can help others to be less wrong in future. Now, the final question, and I have tried tonight to be briefer and to leave more time for your questions and comments, but my final question is simply, would it be worth it? On the best case scenario, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of hassle. It's a lot of upheaval. Could it ever be worth the time, the energy, and the angst it would take to deliver? Some people I have interviewed for these lectures and for the coming book, including some who dreamed of reform in the past, are now worried that it would not be worth it. that it could instead be a dangerous distraction? And the only way I can think to answer that question, would it be worth it, is that it depends. I can think of 3 tests. Could it better enable our mission? Does it commend itself to the mind of the church? And could it be done in a way which maintained the peace and the unity of the church? The Kirk, as we know, is pretty good at departing from matters it is not convinced by. It is far more important that we love one another than that we improve our institutional architecture. Love covers a multitude of Presbyterian sins. We have enough that is divisive to contend with. So if we still could not find a convincing measure of agreement, that would, I think, be clear enough guidance to just leave it alone and work well with what we have. I said at the outset there were 4 great tasks in front of the church: spiritual renewal, liturgical renewal, missional refocusing, and institutional reform. And if there is no way to progress the 4th, the other 3 could still be transformative. The management guru Peter Drucker famously said that culture eats strategy. No amount of structural change, even when well conceived, will overcome a culture that does not embrace or endorse it, that does not itself commit to grow and change. But culture also floats strategy. Culture is, as Geertz said, the set of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And it's the life those stories reflect and sustain. I want to thank you for being so generous and patient with my storytelling over these past 3 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you again, Doug. And as Doug has said, he wanted to leave a bit more time this evening for dialogue. So let's use that time either for questions online or questions from the audience this evening. Is the microphone around, Professor Torrance? Professor Torrance promised he wouldn't ask too difficult a question.
Doug, is this thing on? Yes. Doug, thank you. Thank you for the way in which you have, in a sense, stuck your neck out and said all sorts of interesting, in some ways explosive things in a coherent way. And, it's much to your credit and much appreciated. Now here's what is in a sense rather a complicated question. The Anglican sociologist Linda Woodhead, by dint of much analysis of different worshipping groups, saw 3 different elements in the practice of religion. First, the perennial, what people do every day. Second, the ritual, in which the perennial is lifted up and ritualized. And thirdly, the doctrinal. And in Linda's argument, strong religions are those which forefront the perennial, and weak religions are those which forefront the doctrinal. And of course, classically, the Presbyterian churches have forefronted the doctrinal, and they fall out with each other and they split. And actually, this is the tendency in Christianity generally. So that's, in a sense, context. Now, you begin with the notion of mission, and of course, I'm simply listening to a 30-minute exposition. But as it comes across, what you call mission seems to me to be a largely unexamined intellectual notion. And that worries me. Of course, mission is a good. Who could deny that? But this does look rather like an intellectual virtue to me. And then following that up with the second point, that there are many studies of religion at ground level today, modern religion, which say that the big religions are actually too greedy and want to absorb too much of people's lives. And today people actually don't want to yield that much of their lives to religion. They want a range of other ways in which they negotiate the crises of life. And I wonder if your notion, unexamined notion of mission, assumes too much and is actually too greedy.
Well, thank you very much for your question there. Of course, I'm not going to agree with you that my notion of mission is unexamined. I think it's very cheeky of you to suggest that it is. And I'm not sure if you had the benefit of listening to the other two lectures yet, but if you haven't listened to the first one, you may find that helps. Both because I think I spell out the different dimensions of mission that I'm talking about, but also I think in reference to Charles Taylor and his notion of fullness of life, which I think has a lot to do with what you're talking about in terms of the perennial. The other thing I quoted was G.D. Henderson's comment that Presbyterianism, he thinks, gave too little and asked too much. And I think that may be relevant to what you're saying as well. There's a limit to how greedy our institutions should be. And in fact, one of the things I've said tonight, I think, is that they should be less greedy of our time, both so that we can have more time to rest and to play, but also so that we can have more time to work alongside others for justice and for peace in the world. And that is part of our perennial calling as well. So far from agreeing that my notion of mission is unexamined, I want to invite you to examine the first two lectures and see if they convince you any further.
Anyone
Great
else?
question, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Another question over here, the microphone. I can't see.
In your lectures, Jim McGowan from Linus and Senate St Kenneth Church in Govan in Glasgow. In the lectures you dealt with the structure of the church itself within George Street, Glasgow Presbytery and various other places. But I'm trifle disappointed that you haven't dealt with where we are going with the very important service and mission of the church. In my opinion, the model of the church that we have before us throughout the congregations is something of service 11 o'clock in the morning, 5 hymns, 2 prayers, 2 readings, a sermon, and then into the hall for a cup of tea. Same with the Boys Brigade. Our model is failing badly, and it's because the young people, and young people is a very broad young people of today, are not there. Look at the meeting we have tonight. Where are the people under 50?
Well,
And I say that because I only found out by chance that these lectures were on. They're not advertised to young people to come and hear something new. Nobody tells them. Nobody comes to the churches and announces on the morning, look, somebody's got something good to say about the church. Somebody's got new radical ideas to speak about the church. Because if you don't do it, we won't have any young people in the church. I go to in Glasgow a number of churches, and each of them have very, very few folk between the ages of 10 and 20. All right, today we've had the introduction of things like Messy Monday and everything else for primary school kids. But we need radical change to put the message and the mission across. And there are many good
Do you want to give Doug a chance
aspects
to come back and respond?
of groups doing that. But it's the change in the model of the church in the community and in the local churches that needs to be radically synced. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. And I've preached in the church that you came from at Linthouse St Kenneth, which is now, of course, part of a union there. And the late Moyna McGlynn was a very dear friend of mine, who was the parish minister there in Govan. And I hear your concern, and your pain, if you like, about the lack of young people in church. And I think at the heart of everything I've been trying to say tonight has been this concern: how do we strengthen the mission of the local congregation? So thank you very much for your comments and your contribution.
At the very back.
I've got just one from the internet, if I may. A viewer, Ian, asks, a critique of the role of moderator in recent times is that by having had only one elder in the role, we have modelled leadership as only coming from ministers. How could this be overcome in the new model you are proposing? Do you think the URC system of joint moderators could help empower our elders and lay people?
I think it's possible it could. I mean, I certainly think that task of empowering lay people and of empowering elders is a really important one. I think that's an interesting suggestion. And again, part of what I've tried to do in the lectures is to look around at other Presbyterian and Reformed churches and see, not because if something worked there, it would definitely work for us, or if it didn't work somewhere else, it might not work for us. But I think comparing ourselves and seeing that there are different ways to be Presbyterian, and we need to discern together how we go forward with that. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Doug, for your provocative lectures. I think you've kind of led us to ask more questions and you've provided answers, which I think is brilliant. You've spoken about the priority of spiritual renewal for mission, and you know that I agree wholeheartedly with you at that. So 2 questions, but they're kind of tied. What do you think it looks like to experience spiritual renewal in the Church of Scotland today? And what do you think it looks like to experience spiritual renewal in the nation of Scotland today?
Well, great questions. Of course, if people want to see what it looks like to experience spiritual renewal, they need to go to Martyrs Memorial Church, where Tommy's the minister, and see what's happening there. And I've not been myself, but I'd love to go sometime, because it's an exciting place and a place that is filled with younger people, and where there is creativity and energy, and also I think a realism and an honesty, a sense that people engage with the tough stuff of life and the hard questions. And I think in the first lecture I wanted to, sometimes I worry about too narrow a theology of revival, and I think that's where your second question is really helpful in terms of spiritual renewal across the nation of Scotland. And the front pages of our newspapers today were speaking about a nation which is very divided, which is very economically divided, and where there's a huge issue of inequality. And we've had Martin Johnston and others involved in campaigns in recent weeks in relation to job centres, in relation to refugees. So spiritual renewal, I think, is about this whole spectrum vision of mission. It's about a political renewal where we're looking for justice and peace. It's about an artistic renewal where we lose this reputation the Kirk has had for being Philistine, for not caring about the arts. And it's a renewal of people's desire to participate politically. And I think that's one of the things we need within the church as well as in the nation. We want people to be involved. We want people not to feel that meetings and institutions are just a burden to them, but they are things which empower them, which give them a voice, which give them a vote, and help them to feel that they can make a difference. So great questions, and I'll come up and see the renewal there for myself soon, I hope.
There's a question here halfway down.
Caroline on Facebook asks, can the Church demonstrate how its reform has considered widening social changes and more liberal expectations of current and future members whilst delivering the new strategy?
Could you repeat that?
Yes. Can the Church demonstrate how its reform has considered widening social changes and more liberal expectations of current and future members whilst delivering the new strategy?
Okay. That's helpful. Well, I think in a number of ways. I mean, one of the things I talked about in the first lecture was Henderson's comment that Calvin had a rather aristocratic view of the church. And I think we live in a society where people want to participate and they want to be involved. And so I was suggesting that one of the deficits within our system, I think, is that we have too negative a view of the congregation within church law and church structure. And I think that's an area people talk about, in media terms, the people formerly known as the audience, as media becomes more interactive. And somebody's written an interesting article called The People Formerly Known as the Congregation. In other words, that the idea of this passive group of people, I think, is an idea that does not sit well. And somebody mentioned, you mentioned messy church. And one of the interesting things about messy church, which is not to everybody's taste, but where it works well, it's fantastic about creating multi-generational involvement. And people move from being passive to being very active and constructing something together as part of worship in a way that can be really meaningful. I'll stick with that. The other thing I was going to say, I think, was about eldership. I think that in terms of how society is changing, one of the other things I suggested in the second lecture was that there are fewer people, perhaps, who feel as drawn to the idea of ordination as a lifelong thing in relation to the eldership. And so the idea of introducing a new route to eldership alongside the old, not to displace or rubbish the old way, but alongside it, seems to me also to be another way of trying to respond to ways in which society is changing and people's expectations and instincts about being part of an institution are changing.
John, just here first of all.
Doug, thank you very much for your stimulating thoughts. You've mentioned looking at other Presbyterian congregations. I'm an interested observer of the Church of England, whose mainstream congregations are declining much more slowly than ours, but perhaps more to the point, they have been energized and refreshed by fresh expressions of church. I believe over 3,000 fresh expressions since the concept was initiated in 2004. And if you included all the people who attend that, then the Church of England is probably growing. Do you think there are principles we can draw from that example that might help us to think about our own renewal?
That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. And certainly the research that's been done recently suggests that Fresh Expressions has made a significant contribution to the Church of England. And I've been a long-term advocate of Fresh Expressions within the Church of Scotland, so I'm going to agree very much with you. And one of the things I've said throughout is that, which is why the future looks complicated and why it's also difficult for people in some senses, because we're both going to have to plant new congregations and close down existing ones. And that's a hard thing to do simultaneously. But actually, people in many other areas of life might understand that sometimes when you're going through a period of institutional renewal, that you have to try and do those two things simultaneously. There are some of our congregations that are not going to grow again. It may be that there are geographical factors. There are some congregations where there has been a toxic culture, and in fact, in some of those places, the decline and the death of the congregation is something, I hate to say it, that they've almost kind of brought on themselves. I go back to the question at the end. If people are going to know we are Christians by our love, than if there are loveless congregations which are thrilled to tradition and are deeply resistant to change and are squabbling with one another. Then maybe, let's do something new somewhere else in a more positive spirit in some cases. So I think fresh expressions is really important as part of this debate. And whether we want to, not everybody likes that terminology, but planting churches and replanting congregations. The best thing may not always be where a congregation can't go on anymore. It may not always be to unite it and to close the building and to go off. Sometimes I think we need to think about encouraging some of our larger churches to replant where a congregation has come to the end of its life. And it would be great actually if there were some congregations which sometimes would say, we can't go on here anymore in the way that we've been going on, but we'd love to open this up, and as our gift to the church and its mission, to invite someone else to come in here and to maybe start again. So absolutely behind what you're saying.
Last question. Thank you. I come too far from here. I attended the 3 lectures, and one of the reasons why really I said to myself I have to attend all these 3 lectures because of some of your articles in the Life and Work. And this was last year. I can't remember which month was that. And you were talking about the reform in the church. And in the middle of your article there, you raised a question, and it was like a pessimistic question saying, God is punishing us here. But in these 3 lectures, really you were very, very, very positive, very, very... but in that article, you were a bit pessimistic, talking about God is punishing us here.
I think what I was doing there was quoting the provocative Texan theologian Stanley Hauerwas, who says somewhere, God is killing the church in America and we deserve it. So I was quoting his provocative remark, and I think it's worth pondering over, and maybe actually what I just said relates to that. But I'm so honored that you've been at all 3 lectures, and I'm grateful that you feel they've been more positive than that statement might have suggested.
Folks, I want to take a moment at the end of this series to thank Doug for the way in which he has delivered the content which we actually asked him to deliver. I went back the other day and looked at the remit we had given you from the General Assembly, and it was specifically to look at how within the institution and what kind of institutional structure would we have to envisage in order to work with the kind of changes that are needed to make the church more relevant today. And you've delivered exactly on what you were asked to do. And for that, we're grateful. But more than that, I want to thank you for the tone that you've set. This was not an easy task, and I know you've lost some sleep over this over the last few months, because you knew that in so many ways you might be like Daniel in the lion's den, that you would be in a place where you could tread on a whole lot of toes, but you've done that gently. You have been treading on our toes. We asked you to do that, but we don't feel that you've done it with hobnail boots. We feel you've done it with grace, with humility, with the right tone, and I certainly feel that it has been prophetic, and prophetic for many of us who've been inside the system to hear what you've had to say. And the strength of what you've had to say is because you're just somewhat outside of the system, offside, looking in and allowing us to see ourselves, as it were, as others see us. And I think that's important for us, because often when the attempts to bring about change, especially structural change, come from the inside, there are immediate suspicions. What are they up to? What do they want? What are they trying to achieve? But you have done this with no side to it, and the only real investment you have in it is your passion for the future of the church. So we're grateful to you for the content, the tone, and for the challenges that you've set us for the future. Doug, on behalf of all of us here tonight, watching online, and on behalf of the trustees of the Chalmers Trust, thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Again, please do join us for more conversation and some light refreshments as we gather in the Murray Aisle on the west end of the cathedral. Thanks again.